The Iowa International Center Dialogue Series is a monthly educational program available at no cost to the public, thanks to the generous support of DuPont Pioneer and supporting sponsors. Dialogue events and videos offer a unique opportunity for our community to engage in and learn from important cultural conversations with international experts, and to draw on and highlight the extensive knowledge these individuals bring to our schools, workplaces, and community. For more information about the Dialogue Series and the Iowa International Center, please visit www.iowainternationalcenter.org.
So I'd like to start perhaps by answering the question, why is social entrepreneurship in the Arab Spring relevant to a conversation here in Des Moines and Central Iowa? First and foremost, as most of you are here, the first driver of value is really intrinsic. That is, as engaged global citizens, it's necessary, I think, for us to understand what's going around in the globe as we get more visitors from the Arab Spring, from the Middle East and other parts of the world here to Iowa, and vice versa. As we get opportunities to travel there and create an impact, understanding what's going on from a citizen diplomacy perspective is critical to global engagement, not only for us as individuals, as a state, but also from the US government perspective and business perspective. So I think that's probably the first reason why, at least I'd posit, that this topic is relevant. The second are slightly more extrinsic and macro level as to the relevance. The first has to do with security and political implications. Obviously, there's a tremendous amount of natural resources, as well as 70% of the individuals in much of the Middle East and North Africa are under the age of 30. So from a youth bulge perspective, the demographics and natural resources of that region of the world are critical to global political and physical security. So understanding the dynamics of how the majority of people there are engaged, the opportunities they have for economic development are again critical to, I would argue again, economic and political and security issues for the US, for Iowa, and globally. The third is, again, very particular to Iowa then, and perhaps even to DuPont Pioneer, is, again, given the positioning in the global economy of Iowa around agriculture, agribusiness, and the bio value chain. The Middle East provides a tremendous number of potential sources for capital for those industries, given the food shortage and the requirements of food security, but also from a consumer base. Again, given the youth bulge there, there's a tremendous demand for Iowa-based product potentially in the Middle East. So again, understanding that the issues that are going on from a societal perspective, entrepreneurial perspective in the region, I think are critical to the Iowa economy in particular. So I think those are the three reasons why I thought perhaps focusing on this topic would be relevant for today. For those of you who were at Drake last week, I apologize, but I'd like to probably start my substantive comments this morning by sharing a joke one of my teachers in high school used to tell me about politics. There was a lawyer, an architect, and a politician were getting together for lunch one day. And as the conversation evolved, they ended up having a discussion around God, and in particular, who God made first. So the architect said that God made him first. After all, there was chaos. To build something out of chaos, you needed an architect, somebody to draw plans, etc. So therefore, God must have created the architect first. The lawyer interjected, as any good lawyer does, and said, I object. Granted, there was chaos. Granted, you built things out of chaos. But in order for an architect to build things, you need regulations, you need laws, you need building codes. You needed the lawyer first. So God must have created me first. Two argued back and forth for a few minutes while the politician sat back enjoying his meal and eventually interjected. Excuse me, gentlemen, God created me first. After all, who do you think created the chaos? Politicians have a knack for creating chaos, and for better or worse, from a professional perspective, I tend to operate from a business perspective in the parts of the world where chaos tends to be very dominant. And part of that, as we've probably seen even in the last week's events in Syria, in Egypt, and in much of the Middle East and North Africa, in particular the Arab Spring countries, political chaos tends to be the norm rather than the exception over the last several years. So from that perspective, I'd like to first start by perhaps going into a few of the drivers around the Arab Spring and what created this condition of chaos, and then we'll turn to social entrepreneurship within the Arab Spring. So again, just as a reminder, the Arab Spring, largely focuses on the countries across the Maghreb, Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, North Africa, that band across the Maghreb. And it was started again, or the instigator, the spark for the Arab Spring was when Mr. Bouazizi in Tunisia self-emulated. He burnt himself, and that was driven by generally a sense of a breakdown of the social contract between the Tunisian state and the Tunisian people. The informal economy in Tunisia was very vibrant, but the ability to move beyond subsistence, daily survival was virtually impossible. And again, the expectation was that the Tunisian government and the local governments should be critical as part of a social contract between the individuals of the state and the state, that the state should help deliver an opportunity for people to move beyond subsistence and poverty. But again, there was a sense of hopelessness that triggered or sparked that catalytic event in Tunisia. And from there, it spread. There were three facilitating elements that allowed, again, that spark to convert from simply an isolated event in Tunisia to go across the Maghreb. And those three catalytic events, I'd argue, were, number one, was the existence of a robust civil society. When we look at Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, Syria, state institutions, by and large, are very ill-equipped to deliver solutions. And the level of public faith or trust in those institutions is minimal at best. As a result, other institutional structures that have been a function of civil society, of people getting together, have been the dominant means for mobilization of resources, for assets, and the dominant means how society has continued to progress on an institutional level. So civil society was very, very robust in those countries at that period of time, again, largely due to the absence of state institutions, as well as due to the, partly to the nature of Islam, where again, civil society and social institutional networks are a critical element in Islam and in the Ummah. A second key driver of the transformation from simply a spark to fueling the entire Arab Spring was that the costs of collective action were relatively low for individuals. Again, you got high youth unemployment, lack of opportunity, of real, tangible economic opportunity. A lot of people were not in school. So again, the cost of collective action, their disruptive elements on the progress or trajectory of individual lives was minimal. So it was a relatively low-cost decision for people to mobilize and get together. And then the third was the presence of technology, the opportunity for hyperconnectivity that again facilitated the ability to take what was an isolated event in Tunisia and essentially create a revolution across several countries. So again, it was largely driven by people's dissatisfaction with the social contract, in particular, a desire for economic self-determination that the state was failing to deliver, and that was facilitated, again, by hyperconnectivity, low cost of collective action, and a robust civil society, again, largely due to the presence of cultural and social institutions within those countries. So now I'd like to turn to perhaps some brief points around what exactly is social entrepreneurship. In trying to find a good definition of entrepreneurship, it's been actually tremendously difficult. Lots of people have different ideas of what exactly it means to be an entrepreneur. Is there anybody here who has a definition they believe captures what entrepreneurship means? The best definition that I've come up with and been able to identify is essentially entrepreneurship is the capacity and willingness to develop and manage a venture to produce profit. So critical elements in that definition of entrepreneurship are capacity and willingness, develop and manage, and then the key differentiator between entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship is focused on that profit. So where social and entrepreneurship becomes relevant is that they essentially reinterpret what profit means. Traditionally, profit has referred to simply an economic profit. Over time, some people would argue it's evolved to mean a financial profit. Social entrepreneurs essentially take that definition and either replace it with a social metric of profit or add an additional layer to commercial and or economic and financial profit with a social element. And I think that's the key differentiator, and at least how, from a business perspective, the term social entrepreneurship generally tends to be understood and the way we see it operating. So when we turn to the issue of social entrepreneurship in the Arab Spring countries, it's still relatively at an early stage. My wife and I are expecting our first child at the end of April. So for better or worse, a lot of the analogies when I think of things now tend to work in trimesters. So perhaps part of the way I'll explain the development of social entrepreneurship in the Arab Spring countries is to use a similar sort of trimester optic. So if we look back to pre-Arab Spring, there was a lot of potential. There was an embryo that had the potential, with the right nurturing, to continue to develop. So the two critical elements that were present at that time within the Arab Spring, or within the Arab Spring countries, was first of all the conceptualization of what it means to be a social entrepreneur. While they hadn't per se articulated a desire or alignment to the term social entrepreneurship, as a concept, it was very prevalent. If we look at Islamic history, and in particular Islamic historic scholarship or economic scholarship, going back to the 11th century work of Ibn Khaldun, there are two critical requirements for any transaction to be acceptable within Islam. The first of which is to produce an economic return, but the second of which is to further social justice and social welfare. So from the mindset of every single Muslim, and within the way the economics is understood within a Muslim perspective, social return is a critical element to that profit understanding, to the equation in profit. So again, going back to that definition of entrepreneurship, the fact that layering in a social level of return, again, is endemic to the way in Islam people approach economic activity. So again, going back to pre-Arab Spring, that conceptualization was already very vibrant in an understanding and the perception of economic activity within Arab Spring countries. The second element that I think was present prior to the Arab Spring countries that facilitated and kind of created that potential for that embryo to grow was the presence of an entrepreneurial spirit. Again, much of the Maghreb, you have a highly unequal societies, very high Gini coefficients, where we have a lot of inequality, where access to capital, access to opportunity is extremely limited and based upon relationship networks rather than a meritocratic system. As a result, people needed to be very entrepreneurial, inventive, and innovative to just meet their basic needs, but also created businesses wherever they saw opportunity. Again, the underground black economy was very, very vibrant across much of the Maghreb and throughout the Middle East. And again, there's a tradition of entrepreneurial spirit in many of those countries. So again, thinking about that embryo, the ingredients for it to be nurtured, that of, again, a conceptualization of social enterprise and social entrepreneurship, as well as a tradition of entrepreneurial activity, were very, very strong across the Arab Spring countries. So now in turning to post-Arab Spring events, we get to the second trimester where, again, given those two elements, there's a lot of potential, a lot of nutrients to feed this embryo. But there are a couple of critical issues where we see in the second trimester that either are going to potentially threaten to regress the baby back towards the first trimester or determine whether it moves forward. The first of that is a regulatory infrastructure. In California, over the last couple of years, we've seen the emergence of what's called a B corporation. It's a business that's again, from a tax perspective, is explicitly created to achieve social metric and social outcomes. Again, commercial outcomes are necessary, but that's not the raison d'etre, the reason for existence of that business. When we look at the Arab Spring, just on a or the Arab Spring countries, just on a political level, there's a tremendous amount of chaos, but the regulatory infrastructure around entrepreneurship, but in particular around the ability to create and support new businesses within the social entrepreneurial space are very, very limited. Partly, the government doesn't have the capacity nor the desire to develop those. So the regulatory infrastructure and how it develops in the Arab Spring countries is a critical element that will determine whether or not we go from the second trimester to the third, or we end up regressing. A second critical element is that of access to funding. As any entrepreneur, even here in the US, knows, getting capital to fuel growth is critical. Again, in the US, we tend to have a very vibrant venture capital and angel investor network. Here in Iowa, with the Greater Des Moines Partnership, you've got the Business Innovation Zone. You've got the Des Moines startup community, the tech community. So again, if you've got great ideas, access to capital is fundamental to converting ideas into actual products and services that either produce social or economic revenue, or both. When we look at funding in the Middle East, and again in traditional Muslim economies, funding is generally driven by either access to debt or through retained earnings or family wealth. Again, the majority of businesses in the Middle East are family owned. So when we look at social entrepreneurship, again, they generally, because they're focused on social outcomes, from a financial institutional perspective, trying to access conventional or Sharia-compliant debt is virtually impossible. They tend to be excluded from formal channels of access to capital. The second is, again, when we look at most social entrepreneurial activity within the Middle East, people don't have millions of dollars or don't come from high family positions where they have natural access to family of friends who can provide a few $100,000 to a few $1 million to support the development of new enterprises, or even access to $50,000 or $100,000 to support new enterprises. So access to funding is another critical element in this second trimester that, again, will determine whether or not social entrepreneurship succeeds or regresses back to the first trimester. The third critical element, and this is where perhaps institutions like the Iowa International Center can play a critical role in impacting social entrepreneurship in the Middle East, is around capacity. Again, when we recall entrepreneurship, the definition, a lot of it had to do with capacity. And that comes down to basic skills such as accounting and bookkeeping, but also comes down to strategic thinking, etc. And so from a knowledge development perspective, that capacity, while there is a desire, isn't necessarily developed. And it's not that people aren't intelligent enough, it's just they haven't had access to develop that capacity. So that's the third critical element, is that the inability of organizations that can deliver the necessary training and knowledge base required for successful entrepreneurial activity simply aren't present. And their absence is being exacerbated by the political situation within most of the Arab Spring countries. So as a result, then that becomes the third critical element that will help determine whether or not social entrepreneurship from its current state in the Arab Spring countries progresses to actually create a positive impact, or regresses to a point where it essentially becomes a non-entity or non-influence, non-impact element. So again, there's regulations, access to funding, and capacity are three critical elements in the Arab Spring countries when it comes to the success of social entrepreneurship. So then moving on to what's currently happening in terms of trying to address those three critical issues. So the first critical issue in terms of regulatory infrastructure, quite frankly, there is nothing going on. As we've seen in Egypt, just achieving the basics of political structure and political organizations and government formation is virtually impossible. The conditions in Syria have continued to deteriorate. So basic political stability simply doesn't exist. Therefore, any movement towards creating a regulatory environment that fosters social entrepreneurship or any level of entrepreneurship is virtually absent. As a result of that vacuum, however, you do see a lot of non-state actors or other state actors within the Middle East reacting to address those three critical issues in terms of success for social entrepreneurs. Firstly, they're responding in the sense of access to funding. One of the primary concerns that most of the capital providers in the Middle East, so now we're largely talking about the Gulf cooperation countries, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, Kuwait, to some degree Oman, their primary concern throughout the Arab Spring was not necessarily for the citizens of those Arab Spring countries, but were the implications of political instability within those countries for their own domestic stability. Again, the appearance of a revolution that is founded upon legitimate grievances and the breakdown of a social contract between the state and its people was a very, very politically dangerous idea, especially if it took hold within the monarchy states, again, of the UAE, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. So part of their response is to recognize that, again, the illegitimacy and the inability of the government to address the desire for self-determined economic development for individuals was a critical driver. Therefore, their response has been, how do we address this funding gap? How do we create an opportunity to provide capital to people so they can produce social and economic outcome through entrepreneurial activity? So from that perspective, in Saudi Arabia and in Qatar in particular, we've seen two significant steps towards trying to provide capital to social entrepreneurs in the Arab Spring countries. The first of which is driven by an institution out of Qatar. So about a year ago, Silitech, which is a public policy research organization in Qatar funded by Sheikha Hamoza, the First Lady, for lack of a better word, in Qatar, was to do a joint venture essentially with Kiva. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Kiva. It's a microfinance or micro-lending platform or a crowd-lending platform that essentially extends grants or zero-cost loans to micro-entrepreneurs. So last year, Silitech and Kiva launched Kiva Arab Youth. And again, that was targeted at providing initial seed funding to micro-social entrepreneurs in and across the Middle East and North Africa with the necessary capital to fuel their entrepreneurial ideas. That's had some success, and now Silitech, and we're actually working with them, is in the evolution of hopefully launching a pure pan-Arab platform for funding of social enterprises. So again, the Qatari government is being very, very deliberate in allocating, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars to fund technology infrastructure and then provide the seed capital for social entrepreneurial activity across the Arab world. We see similar actions being taken by the government in Saudi Arabia. In about 10 days, I'll be in Jeddah for the Jeddah Economic Forum, and it is purely focused on growth through youth, and in particular, the growth and development of social enterprises driven and funded by youth, in not only within Saudi Arabia, but looking again across the Middle East and North Africa. So again, the countries of the GCC have been very responsive to the capital funding issue. Again, it's driven by concerns around local political stability. But that's one of the positive trends towards potentially taking us from the second trimester to the third trimester. A second positive trend that we've seen then is this rise in the sophistication of social enterprises within the Arab Spring countries and within the MENA as a whole. We've seen two critical developments in that space. The first of which are incubators, again, targeting social enterprises. Just as we have the tech incubator here in Des Moines, there is a technology incubator based out of Amman, Jordan. That tech incubator, though, however, is largely focused on the use and leveraging of technology towards facilitating social enterprises and delivering goods and services to the mass population, focused on bottom of the pyramid or much of that level of the population that is largely operates outside the formal economy. In Dubai and in Qatar, we've also seen the development of what are called impact hubs or impact incubators. Their purpose is simply to provide an office space, technological infrastructure, as well as some mentorship for, again, individuals who are interested in building social enterprises, who are interested in building either businesses targeted around goods or services that deliver a dual bottom line, that focus on social return. So again, in terms of a sophistication and the rise of an infrastructure to enable social enterprises to provide and address some of those capacity constraint issues, as well as potentially regulatory constraint issues, we're starting to see the emergence of that microcosm or ecosystem within the Middle East and within the Arab Spring countries. So from that perspective, again, where we find ourselves today is at a very, very positive point. But again, the ability to convert it from the second trimester to the third is really going to be evolve around the ability of the outside parties to actively engage in providing access to finance and in providing a facilitative ecosystem that enables local social entrepreneurs to convert their ideas from ideas to actually successful businesses that produce profit and social return. So what are the implications then for social entrepreneurship in the Arab Spring for economic development, the political issues, and then finally the US? So in turning to economic development, social entrepreneurship can be revolutionary in bringing about economic stability and sustainable, inclusive economic growth in much of the Arab Spring, including, I would argue, in parts of the GCC, such as Saudi Arabia, where you have large populations, where you've got a more striated socioeconomic system or ranking. Specifically, social entrepreneurship, again, provides a formalized mechanism, a formalized corporate organizational structure that, again, seeks to deliver economic and social return. In thinking about, again, the triggers or what underpinned the drivers of the Arab Spring, it was this lack of economic self-determination that was driven by the inability of, again, local governments to deliver basic social services, to deliver to the needs of the people. So again, from a formal organizational structure perspective, social enterprises provide an ideal vehicle to create jobs, create economic return, but also address those critical social issues that underpin part of the dissatisfaction that we see that drove the Arab Spring. The second key reason why there's a positive impact in terms of economic development from the Arab Spring is when we look at, again, the innovative financial structures. Prior to the development of social entrepreneurship as a concept in the Middle East, and in terms of a potential format for investment in the Middle East, most of wealth transfer from, for instance, Saudi Arabia to people in Egypt or some of the Arab Spring countries was through donations, through philanthropy that was targeted at relieving immediate needs, but not targeted at leading to sustainable development and sustainable economic opportunity. So again, the development of crowdfunding platforms like Kiva Arab Youth, or there's a crowd or venture capital, angel capital funding platform in Egypt currently called Shakra that was just recognized in November of this year by Thomson Reuters as one of the new innovative elements of economic growth in the GCC at their annual event in Dubai, essentially pooled angel investors to fund social enterprises in Egypt. They just currently operate in Cairo, but it provides up to $50,000 of investment to social enterprises. So the development of financial innovation in terms of providing access to funding within the GCC and within the Arab Spring countries is being driven by, again, the development of social enterprises. Because, again, people have recognized the dual impact and the necessity of those. So, again, from an economic development perspective, social enterprises are critical in terms of addressing the dual economic social needs, but also providing an avenue for financial innovation in terms of new methods for allocating capital within, again, a very structured, hierarchical society by making it a little more egalitarian. In terms of the political implications of social entrepreneurship, again, I'd argue that it's very, very positive. Going back to, again, the seeds of the Arab Spring, the inability of politicians and political infrastructure to respond to, again, the needs of their citizens was a critical driver of the breakdown of that social contract. Hamas was tremendously successful in winning political recognition within Palestine because of their ability to deliver to the social welfare needs of the Palestinian people. And that's why the Palestinian Authority lost a tremendous amount of legitimacy. Again, when we look across the Arab Spring countries, you similarly have a failure of institutionalized government to deliver to the social needs of their population, and you have informal organizations able to do that. Social enterprises, by again providing a mechanism that is not necessarily collectivized or collated around pure social needs, but addresses social needs through a sustainable economic model, provides an element of potential social and political stability in the region by providing, again, a sustainable alternative to address the social needs of the local population. The implications for political stability are significant. And again, when we look at either the case of Pakistan, or even again looking within the Palestinian territories, or even to the ability of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt to galvanize youth and galvanize the population immediately following the Arab Spring, it was the fact that they addressed their social needs and they converted that into a very direct political objective or political outcome. And I believe it was either yesterday or today where, again, the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas have both come under increasing scrutiny and qualification as terrorist organizations in Egypt. So they're, the ability for civil society organizations to deliver on their social contract with individuals is being challenged by the state of political chaos, and therefore an alternative is required, and that's where, again, social enterprises and social entrepreneurship provides a viable, less politically sensitive mechanism to deliver on social good versus political movements in the region. Finally, I'd just like to turn to the implications for U.S. engagement in the Middle East and North Africa, and what social enterprise means for that. From a U.S. perspective, I think the first opportunity and one of the weaknesses of U.S. policy that I think when President Obama first came to office and when he spoke in Cairo and he was hoping to address was the absence of a human connection between Americans and people in the Middle East, in particular Muslims in the Arab world. The opportunity social enterprise offers for citizen engagement is tremendous. Again, from a capacity perspective, there is a need for entrepreneurial mentors. From a funding perspective, the development of global crowdfunding elements provides the opportunity for somebody in Iowa to fund a social enterprise in Cairo or somewhere in rural Egypt, as long as they have internet access. So the opportunity for individual-to-individual exchange is very, very strong as a function of social enterprises, and it allows an opportunity for citizen diplomacy that, again, is critical from a U.S. perspective in engaging in the Middle East, as, again, fundamental issues exist in terms of the inability of average Americans and average Arabs to be able to interact in a productive way to further relationships. The second element or implication is from the U.S. government perspective, again, the development of other forms of funding institutions and social enterprises in the Middle East offers another opportunity for the U.S. government to more actively engage in improving the lives of Arab citizens within the Arab Spring countries and the GCC. It's very difficult, given post-9/11 regulations, Patriot Act regulations, for US-based institutions or individuals to directly donate to local institutions or individuals in foreign countries, just as a requirement of clearing Patriot Act regulations and to get NGOs and civil society organizations approved as a potential organization that they can aid. So from that perspective, again, the development of funding infrastructure within the Middle East that, again, directly channels funding not to government institutions, but to enterprises, provides opportunities for USAID to interact more directly, either by directly funding some of these crowdfunding or crowdsourcing platforms to develop funds that they then seed invest into US-based or other international-based private equity, venture capital, angel investor institutions that are trying to do again, invest in social enterprise in the world. OPIC currently, I think, has a $2 billion budget to promote and seed fund impact investment financial vehicles globally, whether they're US-based or not. So from that perspective, there's a tremendous amount of capital the US government is looking to allocate towards this vertical. So when it comes to development of funding infrastructure in the Middle East for social enterprises, again, it offers a very direct route for the US government to interact with citizens on the ground in those Arab Spring countries and really build that goodwill and create an infrastructural power for the US and win that soft power back. I'd say, and the third, I guess, element of where US constructive engagement in the Arab Spring countries can be valuable through social enterprise is to help create political and economic security for the US in particular, especially when it comes to combating terrorism. As I mentioned, as we saw with Hamas and as we've seen with the Muslim Brotherhood, the ability to address social welfare needs of the population is a critical element in mobilizing youth and winning either passive converts or active converts towards what we would term as illicit activity, including terrorism. It's been very powerful and effective in Pakistan, was very powerful and has been for Hamas, and has been to date a very effective tool for the Muslim Brotherhood, especially, again, given the youth sweet spot or the youth bulge that currently exists in the demographic sweet spot in the Middle East. So one of the ways that the US can look to continue to combat long-term terrorism or the threat of within the Middle East and the Arab Spring countries is, again, by providing real economic opportunity for individuals that, again, addresses the underlying social elements or social hardship that, again, drives individuals away from seeking real economic opportunity towards seeing terrorist activity as a potential path to real outcome. So those are the three ways I would argue that, again, the US government, through combating terrorism, getting more involved in funding social enterprise activity, and then opportunities for supporting and promoting citizen diplomacy are ways that the US can more actively engage in the Arab Spring countries. So in returning to the current situation in the Arab Spring, there is a tremendous amount of potential. But I think, my own assessment is that the political developments of the last few months do not bode very well for political stability, at least for the next several months, if not few years, in the region. That being said, the GCC funding and the need for and desire for local individuals to reach out and engage with people outside of their region on a citizen diplomacy level to actually try deliver solutions for the local population, I guess foreshadows potential to create significant change in the region. So from that perspective, I think, social entrepreneurship in this Arab Spring, I think in a year, we may have a clearer picture of what's going to happen. But right now, I think as organizations like the Iowa International Center promote and allow an opportunity for US citizens to engage local citizens can be transformative in helping tip the balance towards, again, a positive outcome in driving social entrepreneurship in the region. Thanks. And I'll take questions.
That was fascinating.
Thank
Great
you.
insights that I just didn't realize, and I really appreciate that insight. But really, there's just a gigantic elephant in the room that you didn't even mention, and that is really that all these institutions and whatever change is there really only applies to men. Okay? What about women? Okay, women who don't get to have educations, so they won't be borrowing from Kiva. They're treated their rights in most of these countries, if not all, like chattel. They can't borrow. They're more like the collateral of the borrower. They can't hire people. They have no rights, they can't do anything. And really, is there ever going to be any fundamental change when it applies only to men?
Yep. First, to answer, I guess, your last point first, if things apply only to men, no, there will be no fundamental change. Now, that being said, in terms of Saudi Arabia, yes, things generally only apply to men. But again, when we look at some of the Arab Spring countries, in particular Egypt, there actually are very, very deliberate efforts to deliver financing to women-owned entrepreneurs. They are actually a lot of robust, one of the drivers, in fact, in social entrepreneurship in the Middle East, and in particular in Cairo, is a woman-owned organization. That's, again, been fundamental. Her name is Dina Sharif. She was just at the Middle East Institute in DC in mid-Feb, speaking about social entrepreneurship in Egypt. So there are deliberate efforts by, again, the Qataris in particular, to fund women businesses. Now, again, don't get me wrong, there are structural issues, there are cultural issues in overcoming that I think will be very hard, but I think you're absolutely right. Without addressing those, there will never be equality. But again, I think there is a more systematic appreciation of that fact, as well as a systematic approach by the providers of funding and the people building institutions to try empower women deliberately. Now, the cultural change is going to take a very, very long time. But again, you've got, again, if you don't look at the GCC, but you look more across the Arab Spring countries, you have women who are very entrepreneurial, very driven, and for better or worse, are taking back power. As we saw in the Arab Spring, they're still critical issues, but again, it is evolving. But I think your point is very valid. It'll take a long time for it to change completely, but there are efforts towards that end. Does that help answer you? Yep.
Here in Iowa, we're familiar with an Egyptian company, Orascom, that bought the to build the fertilizer plant in southeast Iowa. And your whole concept, where does an enterprise, how do you classify a purely economic enterprise, which I presume would be Orascom, and a purely social enterprise, and where's the crossover, and how do you define that?
Yep. So it depends. Who you? Oh, sorry. The question was, how do you define I guess an enterprise that's focused on purely economic or commercial return versus an enterprise that's perhaps purely focused on a social return to some degree. So from that perspective, to be honest, it's very dependent upon who your stakeholders are. So for most U.S. corporates, they report earnings per share. The reason they report earnings per share is because that's what the Wall Street analysts care about. And that's what we as investors then respond to invest in when we engage in the stock market. But if you talk to any business leader, most of them will tell you earnings per share is a lagging indicator and is a relatively useless metric in terms of how they operate and lead their company, but it's the metric they pay the most attention to because of the external stakeholders. So in terms of how businesses determine pure commercial versus social metrics, to some degree is going to be purely driven by their stakeholders. When we look in the Middle East, 70 to 80% of companies that are publicly traded are still family owned, even though they may be listed on an equity exchange. So when we look at Orascom, again, largely run by a very, very, very wealthy family. So, their desire to focus on a commercial return is purely personal versus their desire to focus on a social return, again, is purely personal, is they own the economic legitimacy within Orascom to make that determination. They don't have other stakeholders or shareholders. Now, in terms of how you actually measure that, again, when we've seen with Coca-Cola, we're starting to see with Shell in Nigeria, even companies that from a shareholder perspective are purely reliant upon earnings per share, they're recognizing that their earnings per share, their economic return, is highly correlated or at least related to their social metrics. I mean, Principal Financial here in Des Moines, I think last year won the award as the leading ESG, environmental sustainability and governance mutual fund manager in the world, or at least in the US. So again, they recognize from an economic return perspective for their financial success to deliver on that economic financial metric, they need to pay attention to social outcomes, either because their consumers are now paying attention to it, so they will respond positively or negatively to that, or because their investors care and they will respond positively or negatively to that. So in terms of how businesses make that determination to focus on an economic or social outcome is largely driven by their stakeholders, particularly in publicly listed or companies with numerous stakeholders. So just as in your own household, if the members of that household decide we want to spend the extra $5 to buy biodegradable trash bags, they will. Enough households do that. Trash bags that end up in the landfill are going to disappear. So it's all about the stakeholders.
Yeah, I just want to get back to the first point there. I was teaching higher education way, and it was school of business. And we had probably a 55% majority enrollment in the school of business. Now that's quite more liberal of Arab states, but it's still nonetheless clearly an Arab state. And so whatever contradictions that entails, they are workable and resolvable in terms of a agreed upon, understood educational agenda. This is the first thing. I was going to ask the question what this gentleman raised about social entrepreneurship is, I think that's what we would call nonprofit behavior a lot in our society. I know they gravitate or focus on the issue of social entrepreneurship, which brings out the point. In Arab economies, how do they characterize the American profit shareholder perspective, which does not have a social compass? And is it considered, in some social sciences, it's considered a social pathology? Clearly not in ours, but, and so this tension, as you point out, is being developed into issues like principle, doing environmental quality industries, it's sort of bringing this together. But how resolvable is that? I guess. And then my last question is, with these entrepreneurships, what is the industry, services, goods that are producible, given some societies are pre-civil society conflict, and others still do not have the advanced infrastructure for formal advanced market capitalization?
So I guess the first question that you asked was around the conceptualization of social entrepreneurship.
Yeah, it's Adam Smith wouldn't recognize it.
Wouldn't recognize?
Adam Smith would not recognize social entrepreneurship as entrepreneurship.
Okay. Firstly, I will disagree with that point. If you actually look at some of the scholarship other than The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, actually a lot of it was driven from Islamic scholarship. And he actually did go back and look at some Islamic scholarship. And again, social entrepreneurship, I think as a term has evolved because from a neoclassical economic perspective, we have tried to divorce society from economics. I think entrepreneurship would by default generally include society and some level of social return, as again, why consumer goods are produced not for the fact that you want to produce a consumer good, it's because there's an articulated demand, a need that society has told a producer, we need this product or this service. That is a social good that you are delivering to an articulated target customer. Social enterprises evolve beyond that by recognizing that in the way economies have developed, those consumer goods have had a value that meet a certain need, but those needs have not always addressed, or those products have not always addressed the needs of the vast majority of people in certain economies as a function of other societal issues, such as political structure, et cetera. So social entrepreneurship attempts to address those inequalities through a sustainable commercial approach. The goal is not to, and I don't think social entrepreneurship is conceptualized in any way as a nonprofit, not here and not in the Middle East. It's conceptualized as a sustainable, profit-making enterprise, but that challenges the very notion that economic profit alone is an acceptable outcome, as well as challenges, I think, the assumption that the pursuit of economic profit alone is the best way to produce economic profit. For instance, in India, one of the things that we've seen when we look at the impact investment community, is that you beat market rates of private equity investment by focusing on healthcare goods and services that meet the medical needs of the 760 million people who can't access traditional formal healthcare. So you've got a business model that is producing higher financial return, better economic return, by focusing on trying to deliver a social good that's required. So again, I think the conceptualization of social entrepreneurship in the US is actually relatively Neanderthal, to use the term, and especially when you talk to investors, compared to much of the rest of the globe, because they're far more sophisticated culturally in their appreciation of the necessity of economics and society as a common goal.
Would the individual shareholder have that appreciation of social entrepreneurship?
In the US, it's a challenge, to be honest. It's evolving, but again, most investors in the US, it's still a level of education. In Europe, yes. In the Middle East, most of them, yes, because it's part of their culture and tradition. Again, in the Middle East, if you look at traditional financial structures, they were based on a concept called waqf, which is essentially a trust or a foundation. And again, the purpose of every economic transaction, be it I go to purchase a bottle of water or coffee at Starbucks, is it has to produce economic return as well as further social justice to be acceptable according to Islam. And again, that is something that is taught, that is understood, that is ingrained. Now, again, it doesn't mean people deliberately think, okay, I'm buying my coffee, how do I produce social justice through this? But it does inform the way individuals organize economically. It doesn't necessarily impact the way the government and formal structures do, but again, that's evolving. But again, there's a fundamental appreciation and alignment between societal return and economic return in much of the world that simply doesn't exist yet in the US, but again, we're seeing its evolution. And my assessment is, within 5 to 10 years, they will be parallel. I mean, Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, they all now have social investment arms in their institutions where 5 years ago they didn't.